When young train engineer Dennis saw a pack of wolves standing on the tracks directly in front of his speeding train, he thought the animals would scatter at the last moment. But the predators didn't move, as if protecting something invisible to the eye. The engineer took a risk and pulled the emergency brake lever, knowing he might not stop in time. When the train finally halted just meters from the wolf pack, and the Grey Guardians slowly parted, the scene that was revealed made everyone who later heard this story freeze with horror. In a small village lost among the endless Siberian forests, where the only source of income was the railway depot, Dennis grew up. He came from a family of hereditary railway workers. His father and grandfather passed on to him not only professional skills but also a special love for these places. When the time came, the young man went to the city to get an engineering education, but the urban bustle and polluted air only intensified his longing for his native lands. Dennis constantly remembered how the taiga smelled after rain and how snow crunched underfoot on a frosty day. Returning to his native village with an engineering degree, Dennis quickly found work at the same depot where generations of his family had labored. He started small, but his determination and innate intuition didn't go unnoticed. Gradually, he was entrusted with increasingly responsible tasks, and soon he was appointed senior engineer. And when he gained enough experience, he was transferred to freight trains, real iron giants that crossed vast distances across Siberia. Dennis loved his job. Each trip was a small adventure for him, an opportunity to see the beauty of wild nature in all its splendor. In winter, these landscapes became especially enchanting. Endless snowy expanses, trees wrapped in fluffy white coats, frozen rivers sparkling like crystal. It was on one such winter day in January, when frost turned breath into silvery vapor and sunlight played on snow crystals, that Dennis experienced something that forever changed his perception of the world around him. It was a routine trip. Dennis was driving a heavy freight train through the snow-covered forest, enjoying the peaceful landscape outside the cabin window. His attentive gaze, as always, was focused on the railway tracks stretching into the distance. And suddenly, approximately several kilometers ahead, he noticed some strange dark spot right on the rails. The engineer's heart skipped a beat. An obstacle on the tracks always means danger, but the distance was too great to make out exactly what was blocking the way of the multi-ton train. Dennis peered intently ahead, trying to determine the nature of the obstacle, ready to apply emergency braking at any moment. As the train approached, the dark spot began to take shape. It wasn't a fallen tree or man-made debris. What he saw made his heart beat faster. There were some animals on the tracks, and they apparently had no intention of leaving the path. Getting even closer, Dennis was amazed to recognize a pack of wolves. Gray-white silhouettes stood out clearly against the snow. The animals stood in a tight group right on the rails, as if deliberately blocking the train's path. Such behavior was so unusual for these cautious predators that Dennis couldn't believe his eyes. Following protocol, he immediately sounded the horn. The powerful blast echoed through the taiga, bouncing off the trees. Usually such a sound causes any wild animal to flee in panic, but the wolves, to his greatest surprise, didn't move an inch. They continued to stand, forming a living barricade in the path of the train. Dennis had mere seconds to make a decision. His survival instinct suggested he should continue moving. The train was too heavy to stop over a short distance, and wild animals usually run away at the last moment, but something in the unusual behavior of the wolves made him doubt. After an agonizing hesitation lasting fractions of a second, Dennis sharply pulled the emergency brake lever. Only a few dozen meters remained to the animals. The train's wheels screeched on the rails, breaking the silence of the taiga with a piercing metallic squeal. The train began to slow down, but not quickly enough. Closing his eyes, Dennis prepared for the inevitable collision. Each second seemed like an eternity. He mentally imagined how the multi-ton machine would crash into the living barrier, and this image made him shudder. When the screeching of wheels subsided, Dennis opened his eyes and was relieved to see that the train had stopped just meters from the wolf pack. But what he saw next made him freeze in astonishment. The wolves stood in a tight circle, heads raised and howling anxiously. They weren't running away or showing aggression. They seemed to be protecting or guarding something. And only when the danger of collision had passed did the predators slowly begin to part. What was revealed to Dennis's gaze shocked him to his core. A person was lying on the railway track, An elderly man was trying to get up, but unsuccessfully. Dennis didn't dare leave the cabin while wild predators were in close proximity. But the wolves, as if understanding his concerns, gradually retreated into the forest thicket. Making sure the animals had moved to a safe distance, Dennis, armed with a poker for self-defense, jumped onto the snow and cautiously headed toward the prone figure. With each step, his surprise only grew. He recognized this person. It was Stepan Mikhailovich, the local game warden who was already in his 70s. This man had devoted his entire life to protecting the forests and their inhabitants, and Dennis remembered him from his childhood. Approaching closer, the young engineer saw something shocking. The old man's hands were handcuffed to the rails. The cold metal dug into the elderly man's wrists, and around the handcuffs the skin was rubbed raw and bleeding. Barely containing his anger and horror, Dennis helped free the game warden. From Stepan Mikhailovich, he learned a soul-chilling story. It turned out that local poachers, who had long held a grudge against the principled game warden, decided to cruelly avenge him for tirelessly stopping their illegal activities. For years, this fearless man had saved animals from traps and bullets, tracked down violators, and reported them to authorities. Many wolves in these forests were alive only thanks to his selfless work. The poachers had repeatedly threatened the old man, but he never thought they would dare to commit such an atrocity. They tracked him during his patrol of the territory, knocked him unconscious with a blow to the head, and when he came to, he was already handcuffed to the rails awaiting the approaching train. Stepan Mikhailovich recounted that when he heard the horn of the approaching train, he had resigned himself to his fate. But then, something incredible happened. A pack of wolves emerged from the forest. These proud and cautious predators, whom he had protected all these years, surrounded him, forming a living shield. If not for their numerous group, Dennis would not have been able to notice the solitary figure of the old man on the rails in time to stop the multi-ton train. Now each time he passes through that section of forest, Dennis slows the train and peers carefully into the snow-covered fir trees. Sometimes he thinks he sees gray shadows flitting among the trees, the silent guardians of the taiga, reminding him that loyalty and gratitude know no boundaries between the worlds of humans and wild animals.